Hi, folks. I'm Shane Graham, professor of English at Utah State University, and I'm going to talk to you today about contextualizing introductions. And I don't want to suggest that this is the perfect formula for every essay. This is just one really effective formula that I found works really well, especially in literary studies, which is the discipline that I teach in. So if you're writing about a work of literature, these biographical or historical or cultural contexts that I'm going to talk about can serve you really well. And it's a great alternative to the introductions that I see in a lot of my students' writing that from the very first sentence, the first paragraph, dive straight into discussing the literary text, sometimes with a little bit of plot summary of that text, but often just assuming that the reader knows exactly what they're talking about and diving into the formal features of the novel or the poem or the short story from the very first sentence. What I'm going to suggest is that you think in crafting your introduction about who the audience is. Most often, if you're a student, the most immediate audience for your writing is your instructor. And of course, that's the person who's going to be grading your work. And so, of course, you want to keep them in mind. But I often encourage my students to think about a more hypothetical, larger audience. So, for example, say that your department has an award for the best paper written in an upper division literature class by an undergraduate student. And so you want to write for an audience who is perhaps not familiar with the particular text that you're writing about, or may not have read it in a long time, an educated, well-informed audience, but not necessarily an expert in the thing that you're writing about. Think about when someone gives you an address and it's a location that you don't know, and so therefore you go to Google Maps. If Google immediately took you to a really tight zoom of a particular street, that might not help you very much if you don't know the area already. So say someone tells you that they live on North Killian's Lane. This is what Google shows you, a tight close-up of the street and the nearest intersecting street. Not so helpful, right? In order for that to give you any sense of perspective, you need to zoom out 3 or 4 clicks. Okay, so it's up Emigration Canyon Road, just east of Salt Lake City. That helps. If I know a little bit about Salt Lake City, I can now find my way here. But imagine instead that Google Maps starts with this larger view, and then you slowly zoom in to the particular location that you're looking for. That gives you perspective. It gives you a sense of where the thing that you're going to be focused on, the address you're trying to get to, lies in relation to something that you know a little better. That's what I think an ideal introduction to an academic paper in literary studies does. It gives the reader context, it helps them to see why the particular text that you're going to study matters, or why some particular aspect of it is revealing and significant and worth paying attention to. So when I talk about contextualizing introductions, it helps to think about it within the structure of a complete academic essay as a whole. And so I've laid out here how I like to think of the structure of an introduction and a conclusion. You always want to start with a title. The Canterbury Tales has already been taken some 600 years ago. And so you need to think of a title that does some of the work of the introduction right away, tells the reader what you're going to write about and how you're going to approach it. And then the first paragraph, sometimes in like a 25-page academic journal article, the first 5 or 6 paragraphs are devoted to building out the contextual background, giving that larger view, zooming out to the larger region, to use my mapping metaphor, before we then zoom in at the end of the introduction in the all-important thesis statement that lays out the argument. This is what I'm going to say about this literary text. All that in usually a couple of paragraphs. I encourage my students when they're writing a 5 to 6 page paper in an upper division literature class to focus 2 paragraphs on helping the reader get their bearings, and then the thesis statement, and then the body paragraphs. And this does not necessarily need to follow the 3 paragraph format that you may have been taught in high school. There's a lot of different ways to organize this, and I have some other YouTube videos on my channel that walk you through how to organize and develop body paragraphs. And then in the conclusion, you want to sort of reverse the funnel-shaped introduction, but you might think about this as the roots of the tree coming out and grounding the body, providing it stability, and helping the reader, to return to the literal level here, to see why this matters. This might be returning to the contextual background that you started with in the introduction, or it might be showing us something new that you have concluded from your analysis of the text in the body of the paper. I call this the funnel-shaped introduction. I think you can see why, because you're starting with some larger context. So let me explain a couple of variants, how this might play out in your actual writing. The first variant is what I'm calling the historical contextualizing introduction. Start again with a title that's both catchy, catches the reader's attention, but also informative, tells them what you're going to write about. And then in your first paragraph, instead of diving immediately into the text, what I'm suggesting is that you start with a hook that catches the reader's interest with a vivid image or a striking fact that in this case might be some fact about the time period that the author wrote in, or the time period in which the literary text is set. And in that sentence, you're explaining the backgrounds and the causes of the historical effect. This might be a place to bring in some of your secondary research, using short, succinct quotations, citing facts from secondary sources. That can all be a really effective way to address the requirements for a research paper while also using it productively to give your reader larger context. And then conclude that first paragraph by summarizing how did the historical event affect society or culture or literature or the particular author that you're studying, which then gives you the opportunity in paragraph 2 to bring this to bear on the particular text that you're writing about. So if you're writing about South African playwright Athol Fugard, you might say in the first paragraph, you might say in the beginning of that second paragraph, Athol Fugard helps us to understand how the oppressive new laws that came into effect at mid-century affected ordinary people. So you're narrowing your discussion from that larger context of the apartheid laws that came into effect in 1948 to a particular claim about Athol Fugard's work. And then this is where you might bring in the formal or the thematic aspects of the text that you see the author using to communicate that theme. And then finally, at the end of the second paragraph, that's where you give the reader your thesis statement. You explain, for example, what worldview you see the author conveying, or what kind of commentary it makes on the historical context that you've just explained. And that's the crucial bit. The context has to match what you want to say about the text. You have to find a way to organically contextualize and explain what kind of commentary the author is making on some historical event. When I talk about introductions, I like to use real-world examples. And in this case, I'm going to use a couple of examples of my own writing in progress, not because I think it's so brilliant I must share it with you, but because, first of all, I can avoid copyright concerns, and secondly, I can explain what I was thinking without having to speculate. This is why I think the author made this move here. I can instead say very confidently, this is why I structured the introduction the way I did. So this is an example of variant 1. And the title of the essay is Recovering Ancestral Memory in Mohale Mashigo's The Yearning and the Parlema. This is a novel and a short story by a young South African writer. But before I start talking about Mashigo or her work, I start with a quick discussion of one particular historical figure who testified at South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 1990s. In August 1996, Yazir Henry testified at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the police interrogation and torture that led him to give up his friend and comrade Anton Franch, who was killed by police after a 7-hour siege. Henry's televised testimony gripped South Africa. He would later write bitterly about how his story was taken up by various media actors. And then I have a quotation from that essay by Yazir Henry, complaining that it was out of my control and done without my permission. This is talking about the media representation of his testimony. Elsewhere, Henry takes particular issue with arguably the most famous and enduring appropriation of his testimony in Ike Krog's memoir and novel, Country of My Skull. He objects to the parts of her narrative that are not hers, to which she lays claim, insensitively in my opinion, without any empathy for my truth and life as a Black South African, recovering from what was done to me under apartheid in her name. And then I conclude this first paragraph. The circulation of his story beyond his control, Henry continues, had a profound effect on his psychological recovery, his personal, professional, and political life. So you can see how in this first paragraph, I'm bringing in some secondary research and using it to contextualize the novel and the short story that I'm about to talk about. An impatient reader might say, what does this have to do with Mashiko, with the novel and the story? And so I try to anticipate that objection. By recirculating the story yet again, I of course risk repeating and amplifying Henry's distress and trauma. And I do so despite the fact that the two texts at the heart of my study, Mashiko's novel The Yearning and her short story The Parlemo, make no explicit reference to the Truth Commission, much less to Krog or Henry. I nevertheless begin by recalling Yazir Henry's cautionary tale, because it helps illuminate one of the key themes in Mashiko's fictional texts, the idea that memory, once given external form through narration or representation, leaves the control of the person who experienced the remembered event in ways that can be further traumatizing. Mashiko offers us a further insight, which is that sometimes casting memory in an external medium, including through storytelling, interferes with the subject's own ability to remember the past event. I argue that while the texts never evoke the Truth Commission directly, they nevertheless serve as coded critiques of the same politics of appropriative remembrance and selective amnesia in 21st century South Africa that Henry deplores in his essays. I go on to conclude, they do insist that these stories must take the long view of Africa's traumatic past, they must be grounded in a broader ancestral memory landscape, and they must account for and mitigate the people's alienation from their ancestors. You don't need to have read the novel and the short story to notice the structure of these two paragraphs. And so in the second paragraph, I'm now narrowing from a general discussion of the Truth Commission and Yazir Henry's testimony to how Mashiko's novel deals with the same kinds of issues of who gets to tell whose story and what happens to those stories once they're circulating in the world at large. So I start using I and me pronouns. I have a whole nother YouTube video devoted to interpretive thesis statements in which I make the case that with this kind of interpretive writing, it's often necessary to say, here's where my thinking departs from what other critics have said, or here's where I'm going to offer my own particular take on this subject that has been much discussed. I hope that helps you see how you might structure a historicizing introduction that starts with this kind of broader historical context before moving into discussing the writer. And this is what I'm calling the biographical contextualizing introduction. Again, starting with that catchy and informative title, and then the first paragraph begins with a hook, and this might be some striking fact about the life of the author, or it might be a statement or an assertion the author makes in an essay, a talk, or an interview. I often require my students in my upper division literature classes to write an essay that incorporates an essay or an interview with the author. And this is a great way to use that material to simultaneously contextualize what you're about to say about some literary text by that author. That first paragraph then ends with explaining how the factual context or the statement by the author from that interview or essay can help us to understand their outlook, their values, their aesthetics, their priorities. What do we understand better about this author and their work for having read this interview or this essay by them? In the second paragraph, you make that transition into talking more specifically about the literary texts that you're going to be studying. These remarks help bring into focus a theme in the author's literary work that might otherwise go unnoticed. This is just one possible example of how you might make that transitional move from the first into the second paragraph. And then you introduce the primary text, give maybe a very brief summary, and then offer a thesis statement that explains how you read and interpret the aspects of the primary text already discussed. And so this might be a matter of adding your own point of view to what the author has already been quoted as saying from an essay that they wrote. These are only two possible variants. You might also think about critical contextualizing introductions that start by summarizing what have the critics said about this novel and then in the second paragraph, moving into where you think those critics got it wrong. It could be some cultural contextualizing introduction that starts with, for example, explaining a practice in Haitian Vodou before you then go on to analyze a text in which that practice is represented and plays some pivotal role in the plot. That's one of the things I like about this formula. It's flexible. You're able to plug lots of different kinds of contexts into that first paragraph before using that as a way to give your reader bearings, a sense of relevance, a sense of why the literary text that you're about to study is worth paying attention to. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, email me at shane.graham@usu.edu and try to answer them.